Many classrooms operate as grade generation machines. The instructional focus collapses onto the terminal number a student receives at the end of a term, often sidelining the actual mechanics of how learning happens along the way. Look at the reality on the ground. A system optimized for numeric outputs traps the student in a high-friction environment, defined by constant pressure of chasing perfection on the next exam. This friction often persists because of a fundamental ambiguity in the system's definitions, specifically the widespread practice of using assessment and evaluation interchangeably. Functionally, they serve different purposes. Assessment is an integrated, continuous process designed to gather information and improve teaching in real time. Evaluation is a macro-level mechanism used to render a terminal judgment on a program's total effectiveness. To address the friction in the classroom, educational managers must look past the jargon and reconstruct their understanding of measurement from first principles. If you blur the lines between measuring to improve and measuring to judge, the system loses its leverage. You retain the ability to assign a grade, but you become unable to systematically improve instruction. We start at the macro level. Evaluation is the overarching framework. It is the systematic collection of data used to judge the total effectiveness of an entire educational program and inform future policy decisions. Educational psychologist Norman Gronlund mapped this architecture in 4 dimensions. The structure begins by setting the target, establishing clear educational objectives. Once the goal is set, the system requires input. We design specific learning experiences, the actual classroom instruction, intended to move students towards that objective. Then we hit the extraction point. We must gather learning evidence to see exactly what knowledge the students retained from those experiences. Finally, administrators take that collected evidence and execute a value judgment. This determines definitively whether the initial objectives were met. Notice exactly where assessment lives inside this architecture. It operates entirely within the boundaries of gathering learning evidence. Assessment is the engine running on the ground, extracting the raw data of student comprehension. Evaluation is the larger machine that processes that data to deliver a final verdict. Extracting that raw data requires precision. If the instrument used to measure a student is fundamentally mismatched to the task, the evidence becomes contaminated. Measurement integrity often breaks down when the distinction between how we observe a student and what we use to record that observation collapses. The pedagogical method and the physical instrument start being treated as a single, indistinguishable unit. We need to separate the two. Techniques refer to the overarching processes you use to observe a student's ability. Methods like direct observation, targeted questioning, or assigning a performance task. Tools are the specific, tangible instruments designed to record the data generated by those techniques. A rubric, a rating scale, a portfolio, or a written test. These are the actual measuring devices. Systemic friction occurs when these are forced into a mismatch. You cannot accurately capture data from a fluid technique like direct observation by forcing it into a rigid tool like a multiple-choice test. True measurement requires alignment. If the technique is observation, the corresponding tool must be designed specifically to record behavior, such as a rubric or a rating scale. High-fidelity learning evidence is practically impossible to gather unless the tool is meticulously matched to the observational process. Even with perfectly matched tools and techniques, the utility of the data is ultimately governed by a third critical variable: time. We can map these deployments across a chronological timeline. At the very beginning of a course, before instruction starts, we deploy a diagnostic assessment to map prior knowledge and establish a baseline. During the instructional phase, we rely on formative assessment. This operates as a continuous feedback loop, providing real-time data that allows a teacher to modify their strategy on the fly. The process concludes with a summative assessment at the end of the unit. This is a hard barrier designed to measure total achievement and supply data for the final value judgment. The timing of these measurements dictates the student's operational role. A summative test at the end of a unit is assessment of learning. Because the data is extracted after the fact, the student acts as a passive recipient being judged. Moving that measurement into the middle of the instructional timeline changes the dynamic. This is assessment for learning, where the ongoing data collection invites the student to actively participate in addressing their own gaps. The ultimate pedagogical goal relies on integrating measurement so deeply that it triggers metacognition. This is assessment as learning, where the student functions as a continuous self-assessor. By shifting when a measurement occurs, an educational manager can completely rewire the student's psychological engagement with the material. We pull back to see the integrated system. Specific instruments, aligned methods, and the chronological timeline nest precisely within the central learning evidence block. Granular data generated by paired tools flows upward, passing directly into the overarching evaluation to inform macro-level policy. Institutional success relies on this deliberate alignment. A test is only as effective as its placement on the timeline, and a macro-level evaluation is only as valid as the granular evidence beneath it. Mastering this rigid taxonomy allows administrators to stop merely managing grades and start actively engineering the future of learning.